wind tore across Silver Hollow with a force that rattled the shutters and screamed through the bare trees like something alive. Elena Marsh stood at her window, watching snow pile against the glass in thick white drifts, when she heard it. A sound cutting through the storm. Low, broken, a whimper of pain that did not belong to the wind. She froze, one hand pressed against the cold glass, straining to hear it again. There. A second cry, weaker than the first, coming from somewhere near the tree line behind her cabin. Every instinct told her to stay inside, to bolt the door and wait out the night in safety. But the sound had something in it that pulled at her chest, a suffering she could not simply listen to and ignore. She grabbed her heavy coat from the hook by the door, wrapped a wool scarf twice around her neck, and lit the old lantern that had belonged to her grandfather. The flame flickered against the glass as she stepped out into the storm, snow immediately biting at her cheeks and stealing the breath from her lungs. The world outside was a blur of white and gray, the tree line barely visible even a few steps from her porch. She followed the sound, calling out into the wind, though she had no idea what she expected to find. A lost hiker, perhaps, an injured deer. She pushed forward, her boots sinking deep into snow that reached past her ankles, her lantern swinging wildly as the wind tried to rip it from her grip. Then she saw him. A massive gray shape lay collapsed at the base of an old oak tree, barely visible beneath a layer of fresh snow. At first she thought it was a boulder, some strange shadow cast by the storm. Then the shape moved, a slow and shuddering breath, and she realized she was looking at a wolf. Not an ordinary wolf. This animal was enormous, easily twice the size of any wolf she had heard of in these woods, with fur so dark it looked nearly black in the dim lantern light, streaked with silver along its back. Elena's first instinct was fear. A wild animal this size could kill her without effort, and every rational part of her mind screamed to turn around and run back to the safety of her cabin. But as she stood there, lantern raised, she saw the wound along the wolf's side, a deep gash crusted with frozen blood, and the way his ribs rose and fell too slowly, too shallow. He was dying, right there in the snow, with nobody to help him. He was dying. She had spent her whole life being the outsider in Silver Hollow, the woman the villagers whispered about, the one who kept to herself at the edge of the forest because there was nowhere else she felt she belonged. She understood what it meant to be alone in the cold, with no one coming to help. She could not walk away from this. "Easy," she whispered, though her voice trembled and the wind swallowed half the word. "Easy, I am not going to hurt you." The wolf's eyes opened. Amber eyes, sharp and impossibly intelligent, fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was something in that gaze that did not belong to an animal, something calculating and aware, as if he understood every word she spoke, and was deciding, in that single moment, whether she was friend or threat. Elena did not know that the creature watching her was Cale Ashworth, Alpha King of the Northlands Pack, a man whose true form had been stolen from him only hours earlier, in an ambush deep in the forest, leaving him trapped as a wolf, wounded, and unable to shift back to warn his people, or defend himself. All Elena saw was suffering. All she felt was the need to help. She set the lantern down in the snow and knelt beside him, ignoring every warning bell in her mind. Up close, the wolf was even larger than she had first thought, powerful muscle beneath matted fur, paws the size of her two hands together. He could tear her apart with a single snap of his jaw. Instead, he simply watched her, breathing hard, too weak to do anything else. "I need to get you somewhere warm," she said, more to herself than to him. "You are going to freeze out here." She had no way to carry an animal this size on her own, not through snow this deep, not against a wind this strong. She thought quickly, remembering the old sled she kept in the shed for hauling firewood. It would have to do. She stood, grabbed her lantern, and ran back toward her cabin, her lungs burning with cold air, praying the wolf would still be alive when she returned. The sled was heavier than she remembered, and dragging it through the snow took every ounce of strength she had. By the time she reached the wolf again, her arms ached, and her breath came in ragged gasps. He had not moved, but his eyes tracked her as she approached, and something in his gaze seemed almost like relief. "This is going to hurt," she warned him gently, "but I need to move you." Getting him onto the sled was a struggle. He was far too heavy for her to lift properly, and every time she shifted him, he made a low sound of pain that twisted something inside her chest. She worked as carefully as she could, bracing herself against the wind, until finally he was settled onto the wooden slats, his breathing shallow but steady. The walk back to the cabin felt endless. The rope cut into her palms as she pulled, her boots slipping on hidden ice beneath the snow, the storm showing no mercy despite her efforts. More than once she nearly fell, catching herself just before dropping the sled and its precious cargo. She talked to the wolf the entire way. A steady stream of quiet words meant as much to keep herself calm as to comfort him. Almost there. Just a little further. Stay with me. When the cabin finally came into view, its windows glowing faintly gold against the storm, she felt a surge of relief so strong it nearly buckled her knees. She dragged the sled up to the porch, then carefully, painstakingly, managed to half carry and half drag the wolf through the door and onto the thick rug in front of her fireplace. Inside, away from the wind, she finally had a moment to truly look at him. His fur was matted with blood and ice, his body trembling from cold and pain. She built up the fire quickly, adding logs until flames roared high, and warmth began to spread through the small room. Then she fetched clean cloths, a basin of warm water, and the small collection of herbs she kept for her own minor injuries, though she had never in her life tended to a wound this severe. "This might hurt," she said softly, kneeling beside him. "I am sorry. I just want to help you." The wolf watched her with those unsettling amber eyes as she worked, cleaning the wound along his side, as gently as she could manage. He flinched, but did not snap at her, did not growl, did not show a single sign of aggression despite the pain she knew she was causing. It struck her as strange, how still he remained, how carefully he seemed to be restraining himself, as though some part of him understood that she meant no harm. Cale, trapped inside the wolf's body, felt every touch of her hands with a clarity that startled him. He could have shifted back to his human form at any moment, could have revealed himself and demanded the help owed to an alpha king, but something held him back. Perhaps it was caution, not knowing yet who this woman was, or what she might do if she learned the truth. Perhaps it was something else entirely, something he did not yet have a name for. He watched her hands move with careful precision, listened to the soft murmur of her voice, and felt something shift inside his chest that had nothing to do with his wounds. Elena worked late into the night, applying salves, wrapping bandages as best she could around fur and muscle, never meant to be bandaged by human hands. When she finally finished, she sat back on her heels, exhausted, and studied her strange guest. He had stopped shivering. His breathing had steadied. Whatever fever had gripped him seemed to be loosening its hold, if only slightly. "You are lucky," she told him quietly. "Another hour out there and I do not think you would have made it." The wolf's ear twitched at the sound of her voice, and for a moment, his eyes met hers again, and Elena had the strangest sensation that he understood every word. She stayed awake beside him through the long hours of the night, feeding the fire, checking his bandages, offering him water she managed to coax him into drinking. Exhaustion eventually pulled at her, but she refused to sleep, afraid that if she closed her eyes, he might slip away in the night. The storm continued to howl outside, rattling the windows, but inside the cabin, warmth and quiet had settled over the room like a fragile truce. Near dawn, when the first gray light began to creep through the curtains, Elena finally allowed her eyes to close, curled in the armchair beside the fire, one hand still resting near the wolf's side, as though to reassure herself he was still breathing. Cale remained still, long after she had fallen asleep, watching her in the dim firelight, feeling a strange and unfamiliar warmth settle over him that had nothing to do with the flames. He had led his pack for years, commanded loyalty and fear in equal measure, and never once had a stranger looked at him with such simple, unguarded kindness, expecting nothing in return. Outside, the storm began to weaken, its fury spent against the mountains. But inside the small cabin, at the edge of Silver Hollow, something new and far more powerful had just begun, though neither of them yet understood what it would become. Morning arrived pale and quiet, the storm having exhausted itself sometime before dawn, leaving behind a world blanketed in fresh snow that sparkled under a thin winter sun. Elena woke stiff and cold in the armchair, her neck aching from the awkward position she had slept in. For a moment, disoriented, she forgot why she had fallen asleep there at all. Then she saw him, still lying on the rug before the fireplace, and the memory of the night before came rushing back. The wolf was awake. His amber eyes were open, watching her with the same unsettling alertness from the night before, though there was something different in his gaze now, something almost curious. Elena sat up slowly, wincing at the stiffness in her back, and studied him carefully. "You made it through the night," she said, relief evident in her voice. "I was not sure you would." She rose and checked his bandages, pleased to see the bleeding had stopped, and the swelling around his wound had begun to go down. He allowed her to examine him without protest, lying still beneath her careful hands, though she noticed the way his muscles tensed slightly at her touch, as though he were holding himself back from some instinct she could not name. "I should probably be more afraid of you," she admitted, half to herself, as she prepared a small breakfast for herself and, on a whim, offered him a bit of dried meat from her stores. He took it gently from her hand, careful not to catch her fingers with his teeth, and she found herself smiling despite the strangeness of the entire situation. "You have very good manners for a wild animal." If Cale could have laughed, he would have. Instead, he simply watched her move about the small cabin, taking note of everything, the way she stacked wood with practiced efficiency, the way she checked the small pantry, and frowned slightly at how little remained, the way her eyes occasionally drifted toward the window with a look of quiet loneliness that she did not seem to notice she was wearing. He had never spent much time observing humans up close. As Alpha King, his interactions with the outside world were carefully managed, filtered through advisors and guards, kept at a careful distance to preserve the secrecy of his pack. But here, in this small cabin, stripped of his human form and his authority, he was simply a wounded creature being cared for by a woman who owed him nothing and expected nothing in return. It was humbling, in a way he had not anticipated. Elena spent the morning tending to small chores around the cabin, checking on him periodically, changing the water in his bowl, adjusting the logs on the fire to keep the room warm enough for his recovery. She talked to him as she worked, filling the silence with the kind of idle conversation one might have with any companion, telling him about the village nearby, about the villagers who regarded her with suspicion because she lived alone at the edge of the forest and kept to herself. "They think there is something wrong with me," she said, not with bitterness, but with the flat acceptance of someone who had made peace with an old wound. "My grandmother lived out here before me. People said she was strange too. I suppose it runs in the family, choosing the woods over the village square." Cale listened to every word, cataloging details about her life with an attention he rarely gave to anyone. He learned that her parents had passed years ago, that she made a modest living selling herbs and remedies to those brave enough to seek her out, that she had few visitors and fewer friends, and that despite all this, there was no self-pity in the way she spoke, only a quiet resilience that he found himself admiring. By midday, he attempted to shift his weight, testing the strength returning to his legs. Elena watched with concern as he struggled to rise, his injured side clearly still tender, and she quickly moved to steady him, one hand pressed gently against his shoulder. "Not yet," she said firmly. "You are not ready. Rest a little longer." He settled back down, surprising even himself with how readily he obeyed her instruction. He was not accustomed to being told what to do, least of all by someone who had no idea who he truly was. And yet there was no anger in him at her command, only a strange, quiet contentment in allowing someone else to care for him for once. As the day wore on, Elena named him, almost without thinking about it, calling him Shadow, for the way his dark fur seemed to blend into the corners of the room whenever the firelight dimmed. She laughed a little at herself for the sentimentality of it, for treating an injured wild animal like a pet she intended to keep, but something about the name felt right, and she continued to use it without embarrassment. "I know I should probably let you go once you are strong enough," she admitted late in the afternoon, sitting on the floor beside him with a cup of tea warming her hands. "A wolf like you does not belong locked up in a cabin. But I am glad you found your way here instead of somewhere else. I am glad I could help." Cale watched her, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something other than the weight of responsibility that came with ruling his pack. He felt seen, in a way that had nothing to do with his title or his power, simply for existing as he was, in that moment, wounded and vulnerable and cared for regardless. That evening, as the sun began to set and cast long orange light across the snow outside, Elena settled into her armchair with a book, glancing occasionally toward the wolf resting by the fire. She did not know that somewhere deep in the forest, search parties were beginning to form, that his absence had already begun to unravel the careful order of his pack, that danger was creeping closer with every passing hour, even as she sat in blissful ignorance beside the very creature at the center of it all. She only knew that the cabin felt less empty than it had in years, that the quiet company of an injured wolf had filled a silence she had not realized weighed so heavily on her, and that for reasons she could not fully explain, she found herself hoping he would stay a little longer than strictly necessary. Cale, for his part, found himself hoping the same thing, though he understood far better than she did just how complicated and dangerous that hope truly was. He was the Alpha King of the Northlands, hunted by enemies who believed him dead or vulnerable, trapped in a form not his own, hiding in the home of a woman who had no idea the wolf she called Shadow held the fate of an entire pack in his paws. He closed his eyes that night beside the fire, listening to the soft sound of her breathing as she slept in her chair, and allowed himself, just for a moment, to imagine a life simpler than the one that awaited him beyond these walls. It was a dangerous thought for a king to have, and he knew it, but the warmth of the fire and the quiet comfort of her presence made it difficult to care. By the third day, the swelling around Shadow's wound had gone down enough that he could stand steadily on all four legs, though Elena still watched him with the careful eyes of someone unwilling to trust a recovery too quickly. She had fallen into an easy rhythm with her unusual guest, one that felt far more natural than she wanted to admit. Mornings began with checking his bandages. Afternoons were spent on chores with him trailing quietly behind her like a great silent shadow, and evenings ended with quiet conversation by the fire, one-sided though it was. She had started talking to him about things she had never spoken aloud to another living soul, secrets and small griefs she had carried alone for years. There was something about his silence, the steady weight of his attention, that made confession feel safe, in a way it never had, with the villagers who whispered behind her back. "I used to want to leave this place," she admitted one evening, staring into the fire while Shadow rested his head near her feet. "When I was younger, I thought about moving to the city, starting over somewhere nobody knew my grandmother's reputation. But every time I got close to actually doing it, something held me back." She did not say what that something was, though the answer seemed to hover unspoken in the space between them. The forest had become part of her, the isolation both a wound and a shield, and she was not entirely sure anymore where one ended and the other began. Cale listened, understanding more of her hesitation than she likely realized. He recognized the particular loneliness of someone who did not quite belong anywhere, having felt echoes of it himself despite the very different nature of his isolation. As Alpha King, he was surrounded constantly by his pack, by advisors and guards and subjects who looked to him for guidance, yet true connection, the kind Elena seemed to crave without naming it, had always eluded him. Leadership demanded distance. Trust was a luxury few could afford when so many sought to use his position for their own gain. Here, stripped of his title and his power, he found himself experiencing something he had almost forgotten was possible. Simple companionship, offered without agenda, without calculation. It unsettled him nearly as much as it comforted him. On the fourth day, Elena decided Shadow was strong enough for a short walk outside, and she led him carefully through the snow surrounding her cabin, watching for any sign that the exertion was too much. He moved with more confidence than she expected, his massive frame cutting an impressive figure against the white landscape, and she found herself admiring the raw power evident even in his careful, measured steps. They had not gone far when Elena noticed something troubling. Fresh tracks in the snow, human boot prints, cutting through the trees at the edge of her property, in a pattern too deliberate to be an accident. She frowned, crouching to examine them more closely. "Someone has been out here," she murmured, unease creeping into her voice. Recently, too. Shadow's entire body went rigid beside her, his ears pinning back, a low sound rumbling deep in his chest that she had never heard from him before. It took her a moment to realize it was not a growl of aggression toward her, but something closer to alarm, a warning directed at whatever had left those tracks. "You know something about this, don't you?" she said slowly, studying him with new suspicion. "What are you not telling me?" Of course, he could tell her nothing in this form, could offer no explanation for the tension gripping his body, or the memories the tracks had stirred. Memories of the ambush that had left him wounded and trapped as a wolf in the first place. He nudged her gently back toward the cabin instead, an urgency in his movements that she could not ignore. They returned indoors quickly, and Elena bolted the door behind them, though she was not entirely sure what threat she was guarding against. She spent the rest of the evening glancing nervously toward the windows, and Shadow remained close by her side, alert in a way that suggested he understood the danger far better than she did. "I do not know what is happening," she said quietly, sitting close to the fire with her knees drawn to her chest. "But I have a feeling you are somehow connected to it. I just cannot figure out how." She studied him for a long moment, and something in his intelligent amber eyes made her wonder, not for the first time, whether there was more to this wolf than she understood. She had noticed small things over the past few days, the way he seemed to comprehend her words with unsettling precision, the way his reactions felt too calculated, too human, for an ordinary animal. She had dismissed these observations before as simple wishful thinking, the kind of anthropomorphizing anyone might do with a pet they had grown attached to. But now, watching the deliberate way he positioned himself between her and the door, she was less certain. "Whatever you are," she said softly, "thank you for trying to protect me." Cale felt the weight of her gratitude settle over him uncomfortably. She had no idea the danger she might already be in, simply by association with him. No idea that the tracks outside likely belonged to hunters loyal to Draven, the rival who had orchestrated the ambush against him. If they discovered he was hiding here, in this small cabin at the edge of Silver Hollow, Elena's safety would be at risk purely for the crime of showing him kindness. The thought troubled him more than he expected. He had spent years making difficult decisions for the good of his pack, weighing lives against strategy with the cold calculation leadership demanded. But the thought of harm coming to this woman, who had asked for nothing and given everything, stirred something fiercely protective in him that had little to do with duty and everything to do with the unexpected bond that had formed between them over these strange, quiet days. That night, he refused to sleep, positioning himself near the door with his senses stretched wide, listening for any sign that the tracks outside belonged to something more than a lost hiker or curious villager. Elena eventually drifted off in her chair, exhausted from the tension of the day, and Cale kept watch through the long hours of darkness, more determined than ever to protect her, whatever the cost might turn out to be. Dawn came without incident, the tracks in the snow the only evidence that anything had disturbed the quiet of Silver Hollow. But Cale knew, with the certainty of a king who understood his enemies well, that this was only the beginning. Whoever had left those prints would return, and when they did, he would need to be strong enough, healed enough, to face whatever confrontation awaited him. For now, though, he allowed himself one more day of peace beside the fire, one more day of Elena's quiet company, before the truth of who he was would inevitably come crashing into the fragile world they had built together. Deep within the Northlands territory, far from the quiet cabin where Cale lay recovering, the forest hummed with a tension that had nothing to do with winter's cold. In the great hall, carved into the mountainside, the seat of power for the Northlands pack stood empty, and every day it remained so. Whispers grew louder among those gathered to fill the void. Owen Fairweather, Cale's most trusted beta, paced the length of the hall with his jaw clenched tight, refusing to believe the rumors circulating through the pack that their alpha was dead. He had known Cale since they were young pups training together in the eastern woods, had fought beside him through countless trials, and he could not accept that his king had fallen to an ambush without a single trace left behind. "We keep searching," Owen said firmly to the gathered search party, a dozen of the pack's finest trackers assembled before him. "Every inch of that forest, every stream, every cave, he is out there. I know it." But hope was a fragile thing, and with each day that passed without success, it grew harder to maintain. The ambush had been sudden and brutal, a coordinated attack by unfamiliar wolves, bearing no pack markings, striking Cale and his small guard while they patrolled the eastern border. 2 of his guards had been found dead. Cale himself had vanished entirely, no body recovered, no trail leading anywhere conclusive. It was exactly the kind of uncertainty that Draven Ashcroft had been waiting for. Draven had long resented Cale's position, believing his own bloodline more deserving of the throne, his own strength more suited to leadership than a king he considered soft, too concerned with diplomacy and restraint, when raw power should have ruled the day. For years he had bided his time, building alliances quietly, waiting for the right moment to make his move. Cale's disappearance was that moment, arriving far sooner than even Draven had anticipated, though he was more than prepared to seize the opportunity regardless. "The Alpha is gone," Draven announced to a smaller, more private gathering of his own supporters, his voice carrying the confident authority of a man who believed victory was already within reach. "Whether he is dead or simply too weak to return, the result is the same. The Northlands cannot remain without leadership. It is time we accept reality and move forward. His words found eager ears among those who had long chafed under Chaol's more measured rule. Wolves who craved the aggressive expansion and dominance that Draven promised, who saw opportunity in chaos, where others saw only tragedy. Slowly, methodically, Draven began positioning himself as the natural successor, offering reassurance to the frightened and ambition to the discontented, weaving a narrative that painted himself as the only stable path forward for a pack teetering on uncertainty. Owen watched these developments with growing alarm, understanding all too well what Draven's rise would mean for the pack's future. He had witnessed Draven's cruelty in training exercises years ago, had heard rumors of the harsh punishments he favored, the alliances he had cultivated with factions known for their brutality. A pack under Draven's leadership would be a pack transformed into something far darker than what Chaol had built. We cannot let him simply claim the throne, Owen argued before the pack elders, a council of respected wolves whose blessing carried significant weight in matters of succession. Chaol has not been confirmed dead. Tradition demands we continue the search before any transition of power is even considered. The elders, cautious by nature and wary of the instability a contested succession might bring, agreed to grant more time, though the pressure from Draven's faction continued to mount with each passing day. Owen doubled his efforts, expanding the search parties, offering rewards for any information regarding Chaol's fate, refusing to let the flame of hope extinguish entirely, despite the mounting evidence suggesting his king might truly be lost. It was during one such search that a young tracker named Felix returned with troubling news. He had discovered signs near the eastern border, faint traces of a struggle consistent with the reported ambush site, along with something far more curious. Wolf tracks, unusually large, leading away from the scene toward the edge of Silver Hollow, a human settlement bordering the forest that the pack rarely had reason to venture near. The tracks are strange, Felix reported to Owen, kneeling before him, with genuine confusion evident on his face. They belong to a wolf, clearly, but the pattern suggests injury, a limp perhaps, and they lead directly toward human territory. I have never known Chaol to venture that close to a settlement. Owen's heart raced at the news, a flicker of hope reigniting, despite his attempts to remain cautious. If Chaol had survived the ambush, wounded and disoriented, seeking any shelter he could find, human territory at the edge of the forest might explain why the search parties combing the deeper woods had found no trace of him. Gather a small party, Owen ordered immediately. We investigate Silver Hollow at once. Quietly. The last thing we need is Draven's faction learning of this before we have confirmed anything. But secrets rarely stayed contained within a pack as deeply divided as the Northlands had become, and word of Felix's discovery reached Draven's allies far faster than Owen had hoped. Among Draven's most loyal followers was a cunning tracker named Silas, whose loyalty to the cause of ambition ran deeper than any loyalty to truth or tradition. When Silas learned of the tracks leading toward Silver Hollow, he immediately understood the danger such information posed to Draven's carefully constructed narrative of Chaol's demise. If Chaol was alive, wounded but recovering somewhere within human territory, everything Draven had built over these past days of uncertainty would collapse the moment their king returned to reclaim his throne. Silas made his decision quickly, gathering a small group of hunters loyal only to Draven's cause, intent on reaching Silver Hollow first, and ensuring that whatever Owen's search party found there would arrive too late to matter. If the Alpha lives, Silas instructed his men grimly as they prepared to move out into the winter darkness, we make certain he does not survive to reclaim what Draven has already begun to build. Whatever it takes. Unaware of the storm gathering against him, Chaol remained in the quiet safety of Elena's cabin, still trapped in his wolf form, still healing from wounds that had nearly claimed his life. He had no way of knowing that two very different search parties were now converging toward the very place he had taken refuge, one intent on rescue, the other intent on ensuring he never returned to challenge Draven's rising ambition. The fragile peace he had found within those cabin walls, the quiet comfort of Elena's company and the strange, unexpected warmth that had grown between them, existed now on borrowed time, the clock ticking down toward a confrontation that would soon force every secret into the open, whether either of them was ready for it or not. 5 days had passed since Elena first found Shadow collapsed in the snow, and the bond between them had deepened into something she found increasingly difficult to name. She woke each morning to find him already alert, waiting for her, and she had begun to structure her entire day around his presence, in a way that both puzzled and pleased her. She told herself it was simply gratitude, the natural affection one might feel for an animal that had come to trust her so completely. But late at night, lying awake and listening to the quiet sound of his breathing by the fire, she suspected the truth ran deeper than she was ready to admit. That morning, she noticed something had shifted in him. He seemed restless, pacing near the windows, his ears constantly swiveling toward the forest, as though listening for something she could not hear. She had grown accustomed to reading his moods over the past days, and this particular tension reminded her uncomfortably of the day they had found the tracks in the snow. "Something is wrong again, isn't it?" she said, setting down the cloth she had been using to clean her small kitchen. "You have that look." Shadow's response was to move closer to the door, positioning his body protectively between her and the entrance, a low sound rumbling in his chest that had become familiar over the past days as his particular warning signal. Elena felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the winter cold seeping through the cabin walls. "I trust you," she said quietly, kneeling beside him and resting a hand on his broad shoulder. "Whatever is coming, I trust that you will protect me. But I need you to trust me too. Tell me what I should be preparing for." Of course he could tell her nothing, trapped as he was within a form that stripped him of speech, of the ability to explain the danger he sensed approaching from multiple directions at once. He could feel it in the air, a shift in the forest's rhythm that his instincts recognized even without clear evidence, the sense of unfamiliar wolves moving through territory that had until now remained undisturbed by his pack's business. He nudged her gently toward the back of the cabin, away from the windows, and Elena, trusting the instincts that had guided him correctly before, followed his lead without protest. She gathered a few essential supplies quietly, a knife she kept for practical purposes rather than protection, extra blankets, a small bag of dried food, uncertain what exactly she was preparing for, but unwilling to be caught unprepared. Hours passed in tense quiet, Shadow remaining alert by the window despite her attempts to coax him into resting, his eyes fixed on the tree line with unwavering focus. When the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow outside, Elena finally heard what he had apparently sensed hours earlier. The soft crunch of footsteps in snow, multiple sets, moving with deliberate caution through the trees surrounding her property. "Someone is out there," she whispered, her heart pounding as she pressed herself against the wall beside the window, peering carefully through a gap in the curtains. She could make out shapes in the fading light, 3 figures moving through the trees, their postures suggesting caution rather than casual wandering. They were not villagers out for an evening walk. Something about the deliberate way they moved, spreading out slightly as they approached, spoke of purpose and intention that made her blood run cold. Shadow's entire body had gone rigid beside her, a growl building steadily in his chest, louder now than she had ever heard from him before. She placed a trembling hand on his back, uncertain whether she was trying to calm him or simply seeking reassurance for herself. "Please," she whispered, "please do not let them hurt us." The figures drew closer to the cabin, and Elena caught fragments of low conversation, carried on the wind, voices discussing something about tracks and scent, about confirming a target before making any move. She did not understand the words fully, but the clinical, hunting tone of their conversation left no doubt in her mind that these were not friendly visitors. Kale, listening with senses far sharper than Elena's own, recognized enough of the conversation to understand exactly who had found them. These were Draven's men, hunters sent specifically to track him down, and their presence here meant his enemies had somehow discovered his location far faster than he had anticipated. The realization sent a surge of protective fury through him that momentarily overwhelmed even the pain still lingering from his injuries. He could not allow them to find Elena defenseless. Whatever happened next, whatever price he had to pay to protect her, he would not allow harm to come to the woman who had shown him nothing but kindness when she owed him nothing at all. The footsteps circled closer, and Elena held her breath, watching through the gap in the curtains as one of the figures paused directly outside her fence line, seeming to study the cabin with unsettling patience. She recognized, with a sinking feeling, that they were not simply passing through. They were searching for something specific, and every instinct told her that something was the wolf currently pressed protectively against her side. "They are looking for you," she breathed, the realization washing over her with sudden clarity. "Whatever you are, whoever you really are, they are hunting you." Shadow met her eyes, and in that intense amber gaze, Elena saw something she could not fully interpret. A combination of fear, not for himself, but for her, and a fierce, burning determination that spoke of a will far stronger than any ordinary animal could possess. She understood, in that moment, that the wolf she had spent 5 days caring for was far more than he appeared to be, though the full truth still remained tantalizingly out of reach. The figures outside began moving toward the cabin's front door, their footsteps now unmistakably deliberate, and Elena felt panic rising in her throat. She had no weapons capable of stopping determined men with clear intent to harm, no way to defend herself, or her unusual companion, against whatever threat these strangers represented. "Whatever happens," she whispered, gripping her small knife with shaking hands, "I am not going to let them take you without a fight." Shadow's growl deepened into something far more dangerous, his muscles coiling with barely restrained power as the footsteps stopped directly outside her door. Elena braced herself, uncertain what horrors the next few moments might bring, unaware that the creature beside her was gathering himself for a confrontation that would finally reveal the truth she had unknowingly been living alongside for 5 extraordinary days. The door handle rattled once, testing the lock, and in that suspended moment of terrible anticipation, Elena realized that whatever happened next would change everything she thought she understood about the wolf she had called Shadow, and about the strange, dangerous world she had unknowingly stumbled into the night she chose to save a dying stranger from the storm. The door handle rattled a second time, and then, to Elena's disbelieving relief, a voice outside spoke in hushed, urgent tones that carried just enough through the thin wood for her to catch fragments. Something about wasted time, about the trail growing cold further north, about needing to report back before nightfall made tracking impossible. The footsteps that had seemed so purposeful moments before began retreating, moving away from the cabin and back toward the tree line with the same cautious efficiency they had arrived with. Elena remained frozen against the wall for several long minutes after the sounds faded completely, her heart still hammering, the knife still clutched tightly in her trembling hand. Shadow's growl slowly subsided beside her, though his body remained tense, ears still angled toward the window, as though verifying the threat had truly passed. "They are gone," she finally whispered, though she made no move to relax her posture. "I think they are actually gone." Minutes stretched into what felt like an hour before she finally allowed herself to breathe normally again, sliding down the wall until she sat on the floor beside Shadow, her legs no longer willing to support her properly. He pressed close against her side, a solid and reassuring warmth, and she found herself leaning into him without hesitation, seeking comfort from the same creature that had somehow become the center of tonight's terror. "I do not understand any of this," she admitted quietly, her voice still shaking slightly. "But I know you tried to protect me. Whatever you are, whatever they wanted with you, I know that much is true." Cale remained still beside her, allowing her to lean against him, wishing desperately that he could offer some explanation, some comfort beyond simple physical presence. The frustration of his trapped form had never felt more acute than in this moment, watching the woman who had saved his life, shaken and afraid because of dangers connected entirely to his own identity, dangers she did not deserve to be caught up in. They remained like that for a long while, until the adrenaline finally began to fade and exhaustion took its place. Elena eventually rose, checking the locks on every window and door with an obsessive thoroughness that spoke of lingering fear, before finally settling back into her armchair by the fire. Shadow took up his usual position nearby, though tonight he remained far more alert than his typical evening rest. His senses stretched toward the forest even as exhaustion pulled at his own healing body. "I keep thinking about the tracks we found a few days ago," Elena said eventually, breaking the silence that had settled over the cabin. "Those men tonight, they must be connected somehow. This has been building for days, hasn't it? And I have just been too distracted to notice properly." She looked at him then, with a searching expression, as though hoping he might somehow answer the questions swirling in her mind. Shadow held her gaze steadily, and for a moment, something passed between them that felt remarkably close to genuine communication, an understanding that transcended the barrier of species and speech. "I am not afraid of you," she said softly. "I want you to know that. Whatever secrets you are carrying, whatever danger follows you, I do not regret pulling you out of that storm. I would do it again." The words settled over Cale like a balm, easing something in his chest that had been tight with worry, since the moment those hunters had approached her home. He had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who valued him for his position, his power, his usefulness to their own ambitions. Elena's simple, unwavering loyalty, offered to a wounded wolf, with no name and no explanation, struck him as more valuable than any oath of fealty he had ever received from his own pack. Over the following 2 days, their bond continued to deepen in ways that surprised them both. Elena began sharing small tasks with him, as though he were a true companion, rather than an injured animal she happened to be nursing, walking beside him through the snow when his strength allowed, talking through her thoughts and worries as they worked together to prepare the cabin against the possibility of further trouble. She taught him, in her way, about the small rhythms of her solitary life, the particular creak of the third floorboard near the hearth, the best hours for gathering firewood before the cold grew too bitter, the quiet satisfaction of watching frost patterns form on glass in the early morning light. He, in turn, offered what comfort and protection he could manage in his current form, positioning himself as a barrier between her and any perceived threat, learning to anticipate her needs before she voiced them. "You know," she said one evening, sitting close beside him with a cup of tea warming her hands, "I think I have told you more about myself in these past few days than I have told anyone in years. That probably says something troubling about how isolated I have let myself become." She laughed softly at her own admission, though there was a note of genuine reflection beneath the humor. Cale found himself wishing, more fiercely than he had wished for anything in longer than he could remember, that he could offer his own truths in return, could tell her about the weight of leadership he carried, about the isolation of a throne that demanded distance from genuine connection, about how her simple company had reminded him of something he had nearly forgotten how to feel. "Whatever happens next," she continued, her voice growing quieter, more thoughtful, "I am glad you found your way to my door that night. I know that probably sounds strange, given everything that has happened since, but it is true." Cale rested his head gently against her leg, the closest gesture of affection his current form allowed, and Elena's hand found its way into the fur at his neck, scratching gently in a rhythm that had become second nature between them over these past days. Neither of them spoke of the danger still lurking beyond the cabin walls, of the hunters who had retreated, but not, Cale suspected, abandoned their search entirely. For this one evening, they allowed themselves the simple comfort of each other's company, unaware that the fragile peace they had built together was rapidly approaching its final hours. The window shattered inward without warning, glass scattering across the wooden floor as a heavy object crashed through it, and Elena screamed as she scrambled backward from her chair, her heart slamming against her ribs. Shadow was already moving, positioning himself between her and the broken window before she had even fully registered what was happening, a snarl tearing from his throat that sounded nothing like the gentle companion she had grown accustomed to over the past week. Through the jagged hole in the glass, she saw them. Silas and his men had returned, no longer bothering with caution or subtlety, their patience apparently exhausted after days of careful searching. 3 figures moved swiftly around the perimeter of the cabin, and Elena caught the glint of weapons in the moonlight, unmistakable and terrifying. "Get back," she heard a rough voice command from outside. "The wolf is in there. Confirmed. Take the door." Elena's mind raced, terror and confusion warring for dominance as she tried to process the reality unfolding around her. These men were not simply hunters stumbling upon a wild animal. Their words confirmed what she had suspected for days, that Shadow was the specific target of their search, though the reason still eluded her completely. The front door buckled under a heavy blow, wood splintering around the lock, and Elena grabbed the small knife she had kept close since the first encounter, though she knew with sick certainty how little protection it would offer against armed men with clear violent intent. Shadow's growl intensified, his entire body coiled with tension, and Elena realized with dawning horror that he intended to fight them, wounded and outnumbered as he was. "No," she gasped, reaching toward him instinctively. "You cannot. You are still healing. You will not survive against 3 of them." But there was no time for further protest. The door burst open, and Silas stepped through first, a cruel smile spreading across his face as his eyes landed on the massive wolf standing protectively before Elena. "There you are," Silas said, his voice carrying a satisfaction that made Elena's blood run cold. "Did you really think you could hide forever, hiding among humans like some coward?" Something in his words struck Elena with sudden, terrible clarity. This man was not speaking to an ordinary animal. He was speaking to Shadow, as though addressing a person, someone capable of understanding insult and provocation, someone with history and identity that stretched far beyond the simple wolf she had nursed back to health. Shadow lunged forward with a speed that startled even Elena, who had witnessed his recovery over the past week, but had never seen the full extent of his strength unleashed. He collided with the nearest hunter, sending the man sprawling backward through the doorway, but the numbers were against him, and Elena watched in horror as the second hunter raised a weapon, aimed directly at Shadow's exposed side. Without thinking, without considering the danger to herself, Elena threw herself forward, grabbing at the hunter's arm and disrupting his aim, just enough that his shot went wide, embedding itself harmlessly in the wooden wall, instead of striking its intended target. The hunter turned on her with fury, and for one terrifying moment, Elena thought her interference had cost her everything. Then the room exploded with light. Elena stumbled backward, shielding her eyes, as a blinding golden glow erupted from where Shadow had been standing only moments before. The transformation happened faster than her mind could properly track. Fur receding into skin, 4 legs reshaping into 2, the massive wolf's silhouette twisting and shifting until, where her injured companion had stood, a man now crouched, tall and powerful, his dark hair falling across a face carved with sharp, commanding features, his eyes the same striking amber that had watched her so intently for the past week. He wore no shirt, and the wound she had tended so carefully was visible along his exposed side, though somehow, impossibly, he moved with the same lethal grace she had witnessed in his wolf form, turning immediately to intercept the hunter who had turned his weapon toward Elena. "You will not touch her," the man said, his voice deep and commanding, carrying an authority that filled the small cabin with unmistakable weight. Elena stood frozen, staring in complete shock as the wolf she had called Shadow, the creature she had nursed through fever and injury, the companion she had confided in through long quiet evenings, moved before her now in the form of a man, fighting with a fierce, controlled power that spoke of extensive training and considerable strength. Silas's confident smile faltered, replaced by something closer to genuine alarm. "The Alpha King," he breathed, taking an involuntary step backward. "You have healed enough to shift. Draven will not be pleased." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Alpha King. The stranger fighting to protect her, the wolf she had unknowingly grown so deeply attached to over the past week, was no ordinary creature at all, but some kind of ruler, someone with enemies powerful enough to send armed hunters after him, someone whose entire existence she had fundamentally misunderstood from the very first night she found him, collapsed in the snow. The fight that followed happened almost too quickly for Elena to fully process, the man moving with a speed and precision that spoke of years of combat experience, disarming the remaining hunters with efficient, controlled strikes that left them incapacitated, but alive on her cabin floor. Silas, seeing the battle turning decisively against his men, retreated through the broken door and disappeared into the darkness beyond, abandoning his companions rather than risk further confrontation. When the immediate danger had passed, the man turned to face Elena fully, and she saw for the first time the exhaustion evident in his expression, the toll the sudden transformation and fight had taken on a body still recovering from serious injury. He took an unsteady step toward her, one hand extended as though to offer reassurance, but Elena found herself backing away instead, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of everything she had just witnessed. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though the question carried the force of everything she needed answered. "What are you really?" The man, Kale, met her gaze steadily, despite his obvious exhaustion, understanding that the fragile trust they had built over the past week now hung in precarious balance, threatened by truths he could no longer keep hidden from the woman who had saved his life, without ever knowing exactly what she was saving. Elena's hands trembled as she stared at the man standing in her cabin, broken glass and splintered wood scattered across the floor around them, 2 unconscious hunters, testament to the violence that had just erupted in what had been, until moments ago, the quiet safety of her home. Everything about this moment felt impossible. The wolf she had cared for, revealed as something entirely different, something with power and enemies she could barely begin to comprehend. "My name is Kale Ashworth," he said finally, his voice steady, despite the visible strain of exhaustion pulling at his features. "I am the Alpha King of the Northlands Pack. 5 days ago, I was ambushed while patrolling my territory. My attackers used something that stripped my ability to shift back to human form, trapping me as a wolf, wounded and unable to return to my people or explain what had happened. Elena listened in stunned silence, pieces of the past week rearranging themselves in her mind with dizzying speed. The strange intelligence in his eyes from the very first night. The way he seemed to understand every word she spoke. The tracks in the snow, the hunters who had come searching with such deliberate purpose. All of it suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. "You could have told me," she said, her voice cracking slightly between hurt and disbelief. "Once you healed enough to shift back, you could have explained everything. Why did you let me keep believing you were simply an injured animal?" Cale's expression shifted, something vulnerable crossing his commanding features. "I was not strong enough to shift until tonight," he admitted. "The wound your care healed was severe enough to block my ability to transform for days. But even before that became relevant, I confess I hesitated. I did not know who you were, whether revealing my identity might bring danger to your door faster than it already had, or whether you might react with fear, rather than the kindness you showed a simple wolf." "So you used me," Elena said, the words coming out sharper than she intended, years of feeling like an outsider suddenly crystallizing into this fresh wound of betrayal. "You let me believe things about you that were not true, let me care for you, confide in you, while all along you were hiding an entire identity from me." "I never lied about who I was in the moments we shared," Cale said quietly, taking a careful step closer, despite her obvious distress. "Every conversation, every quiet evening, every moment of comfort we found together, that was real, Elena. I was simply unable to speak the words explaining my circumstances. The connection between us was never a deception." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, trying to reconcile the gentle companion she had grown to care for with this powerful, commanding stranger now standing in her cabin. His very presence explaining the danger that had shadowed her home for the past several days. "Those men," she said slowly, "they were trying to kill you. Because of who you are. Because you rule some kind of pack." "Yes," Cale confirmed grimly. "While I was trapped in wolf form, unable to defend my position, or explain my absence, a rival within my pack has been maneuvering to claim the throne for himself. His name is Draven, and he sent those hunters to ensure I never returned to challenge his ambitions. If I had died out there in the storm, or if his men had succeeded tonight, he would have secured his position permanently." The weight of his words settled over Elena slowly, the full scope of the danger she had unknowingly been living alongside finally becoming clear. This was not simply a wild animal she had nursed back to health. This was a king, embroiled in a power struggle with life or death stakes, and by helping him, by sheltering him in her home, she had unknowingly placed herself directly in the path of that conflict. "What happens now?" she asked, fear and uncertainty coloring her voice. "Those men escaped tonight. Will they return? Will more come looking?" "I will not allow harm to come to you because of my presence here," Cale said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisive commitments. "I need to return to my pack, to reclaim my position, before Draven's grip on power grows too strong to challenge. But I will not leave you here defenseless, not after everything you have done for me." Elena studied him carefully, searching his face for any sign of the deception she feared, though she found only earnest concern reflected in his amber eyes, the same eyes that had watched her so intently through 5 days of quiet companionship. Despite the shock and hurt still churning within her, she could not deny the genuine care evident in his expression, could not simply dismiss the connection they had built together as though it had never existed. "I do not know what to think anymore," she admitted, exhaustion finally catching up with the overwhelming events of the night. "I saved a wolf from a storm. I did not sign up to become involved in some kind of pack war between wolves who can apparently become men. I understand if you wish for nothing more than to see me leave and never return," Cale said quietly, though something in his voice suggested the words cost him more than he wanted to reveal. "But I would ask, before I go, that you allow me to ensure your safety first. Draven's men know now that I recovered here. They may return seeking retribution against you, simply for having sheltered me." The reality of that threat settled over Elena with cold clarity. Whatever confusion and hurt she felt about the deception, however unintentional, the practical danger remained undeniable. She was no longer simply the reclusive woman living alone at the edge of Silver Hollow. She had become, through circumstances entirely beyond her understanding a week ago, a target in a conflict she barely comprehended. "What do you propose?" she asked finally, some of her earlier fire returning to her voice, despite the exhaustion weighing on her. Cale met her gaze steadily. "Come with me," he said. "Not as a prisoner, not as an obligation, but because I believe you deserve protection that I alone can offer, and because I am not yet ready to simply walk away from what we have built together these past days, however complicated that connection has suddenly become." Elena stared at him, the offer hanging heavy in the charged silence between them, the broken window letting in cold winter air that did little to cool the storm of emotions swirling within her. Whatever answer she gave in this moment would determine far more than simply her immediate safety. It would determine whether the fragile trust built between a lonely woman and an injured wolf could survive the revelation of a truth as vast and dangerous as the one now standing before her in human form. The forest erupted with the sound of howls before dawn had fully broken, dozens of voices rising in a chorus that made the hair on Elena's arms stand on end as she stood at the edge of the Northlands territory, Cale's hand steady on her shoulder. They had traveled through the night, moving swiftly toward his pack's stronghold, and the howls now surrounding them signaled that their arrival had not gone unnoticed. "Draven," Cale said grimly, his body tensing beside her. "He knows we are here already." Elena had spent the journey trying to absorb the reality of the world she had stepped into, a world of shifting forms and ancient hierarchies, of packs bound by loyalty and threatened by ambition. She had agreed to come with Cale, not fully understanding what that decision would demand of her, but standing now at the threshold of his territory, hearing the raw power in those distant howls, she understood with sudden clarity that she had walked directly into the heart of the conflict he had described. They emerged from the tree line into a wide clearing before the mountainside stronghold Cale called home, and Elena's breath caught at the sight awaiting them. Dozens of wolves and shifted men stood assembled across the clearing, clearly divided into two distinct groups eyeing each other with open hostility. On one side stood a smaller contingent, wolves and men whose postures suggested loyalty and relief at Cale's sudden appearance. On the other, a much larger group stood arranged behind a tall, powerfully built man, whose cold expression made Elena's stomach twist with immediate, instinctive dread. "Draven," Cale said, stepping forward with commanding authority, despite the exhaustion still evident from their journey. "I see you have made yourself quite comfortable in my absence." Draven's expression flickered with something between surprise and calculated composure as he studied Cale, clearly having expected a different outcome from the ambush and subsequent hunt that had failed to eliminate his rival. "You survived," he said, his tone carrying false pleasantry that did nothing to mask the tension beneath it. "How resourceful. Though I notice you bring a human with you. How very unlike the Alpha King I remember." Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd at his words, and Elena felt dozens of eyes turning toward her with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. She fought the urge to shrink back, reminding herself of Cale's insistence that her presence here mattered, that whatever role she might play in the confrontation ahead, she was not simply a burden to be protected, but a person capable of standing her ground. "This human sheltered me through the worst of my injuries," Cale said firmly, his voice carrying across the clearing with unmistakable authority. "She showed me kindness when I had nothing to offer in return, and she deserves far more respect than your tone suggests you are prepared to give." Draven's lip curled slightly, disdain evident despite his attempts at composure. "Sentiment," he said dismissively. "This is precisely the weakness that has always concerned me about your leadership, Cale. A true alpha does not form attachments to fragile humans. He commands strength, respect, dominance. Perhaps this incident has proven, more than anything else could, that you are no longer fit to hold this throne. The throne was never yours to claim in my absence," Cale countered, stepping forward with deliberate purpose. "Tradition demands confirmation of death before succession, and I stand before you very much alive, ready to reclaim what is rightfully mine." Owen, standing among Cale's loyal supporters, stepped forward as well, relief evident on his face, despite the tension of the confrontation unfolding before them. "The Alpha lives," he announced loudly, his voice carrying conviction that rippled through the assembled crowd. "By pack law, any claim to succession is void. Cale Ashworth remains our rightful ruler." Draven's expression darkened at Owen's declaration, and Elena watched as calculation flickered behind his eyes. the realization that his carefully constructed path to power was crumbling before the assembled pack. "Law can be changed," he said finally, his voice hardening with barely contained aggression. "Strength determines leadership as much as any ancient tradition. If you wish to reclaim your throne, Kale, perhaps you should be prepared to prove you still possess the strength to hold it." The challenge hung heavy in the winter air, and Elena felt the crowd's attention sharpen with sudden, electric anticipation. She understood enough now of pack hierarchy to recognize what Draven was proposing, a direct challenge for leadership that would need to be settled through combat rather than simple political maneuvering. "I accept your challenge," Kale said without hesitation, his voice carrying steady confidence despite injuries Elena knew had not fully healed. "Let us settle this before the entire pack, as tradition demands." Elena's heart clenched with fear at the prospect of Kale fighting, while still recovering from wounds she had spent days tending, but she understood there was no alternative path forward that would not result in even greater danger for everyone involved. As the crowd began arranging itself around the edges of the clearing, preparing to witness the confrontation, Elena found herself pulled aside by Owen, whose expression carried genuine concern. "He is not fully healed," Owen said quietly, echoing Elena's own fears. "Draven has spent these past days training, preparing specifically for this moment. This fight will not be easy for Kale, even under the best circumstances." "Then we need to help him," Elena said firmly, surprising herself with the determination in her own voice. "There must be something we can do." Owen studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, perhaps reassessing his initial skepticism about the human woman Kale had brought into their midst. "Draven's strength comes partly from allies he has cultivated through fear and intimidation, rather than genuine loyalty," he said thoughtfully. "If we can expose that to the pack during this confrontation, remind them of what Kale's leadership has actually provided, compared to what Draven promises, it might shift the balance, even if the physical fight proves difficult." Elena nodded, understanding the strategy forming between them, though her attention remained fixed on Kale as he prepared to face his rival, stripping away his outer layer of clothing in preparation for the transformation that combat would require. Despite everything, despite the fear tightening in her chest, she found herself moving toward him, rather than retreating to safety. "You do not have to do this alone," she said, reaching him just before the fight was set to begin. "Whatever happens out there, I am not simply going to stand by and watch." Kale turned to her, something fierce and grateful passing across his expression, despite the gravity of the moment. "Your presence here already means more than you know," he said quietly. "Whatever happens next, know that finding you in that storm remains the truest fortune of my life, regardless of how this confrontation concludes." The crowd fell silent as both combatants took their positions at the center of the clearing, the weight of the pack's entire future balanced precariously on the outcome of the fight about to unfold, with Elena standing at the edge of the assembled crowd, refusing to look away, determined to do whatever she could to help the man who had shown her, in the strangest possible way, what it truly meant to be seen and valued exactly as she was. The clearing erupted into chaos the instant both combatants shifted, fur and muscle exploding into motion as Kale and Draven collided with a force that sent snow scattering in every direction. Elena watched with her heart lodged firmly in her throat, every instinct screaming at her to look away from the brutal power on display, yet finding herself unable to tear her eyes from the man who had so completely upended her quiet, solitary existence over the past week. Draven fought with the confident aggression of someone who had trained specifically for this moment, his larger frame and rested muscles giving him clear advantages against an opponent still recovering from serious injury. Kale moved with obvious effort, favoring his previously wounded side, and Elena felt each strained movement as though it were her own pain, remembering every hour she had spent tending that very wound only days before. "He is tiring," Owen murmured beside her, tension evident in every line of his body as he watched the fight unfold. "Draven knows exactly where to strike." Elena's mind raced, searching desperately for anything useful she might contribute to a fight she had no physical ability to influence directly. She remembered Owen's earlier words about Draven's alliances built on fear rather than loyalty, and an idea began forming with sudden, urgent clarity. "The wolves supporting Draven," she said quickly, turning to Owen. "You said their loyalty is built on fear. What happens if that fear is challenged directly, right now, in front of everyone?" Owen's expression sharpened with understanding. "It could shift things," he said, "but confronting them directly, especially during a leadership challenge, carries significant risk. I am willing to take that risk, Elena said firmly, already moving toward the edge of the fighting circle before Owen could fully voice his concerns. She raised her voice, projecting it across the clearing with a confidence she had not known she possessed until this very moment. Every one of you claiming loyalty to Draven, she called out, drawing startled attention from the assembled crowd. Ask yourselves honestly, what kind of leader demands loyalty through fear, rather than earning it through genuine respect? Kael showed me kindness and protection when I owed him nothing, and he expected nothing in return. What has Draven shown any of you, beyond promises built on the assumption that your king was already dead? Her words rippled through the crowd, and Elena watched several wolves shift uncomfortably, exchanging uncertain glances with their companions. The distraction, however brief, proved enough to shift the fight's momentum, Draven's attention flickering toward the crowd's reaction at exactly the wrong moment, and Kael seized the opening with fierce, calculated precision. He drove forward with renewed strength, using Draven's momentary distraction to gain crucial advantage, his teeth finding purchase against his rival's shoulder as Draven's balance faltered. The larger wolf stumbled, and Kael pressed his advantage relentlessly, years of leadership experience and tactical skill compensating for what he lacked in fresh strength and rested muscle. The fight's conclusion came swiftly after that turning point, Kael pinning Draven decisively to the snow-covered ground, his teeth positioned at his rival's throat in the traditional gesture of victory that every wolf present recognized immediately. The clearing fell utterly silent, the entire pack watching with held breath as the outcome of their leadership crisis reached its definitive resolution. Kael released his hold after a long, tense moment, allowing Draven to rise, defeated but alive, understanding that mercy and victory carried its own kind of strength that pure dominance could never achieve. Draven's expression, as he rose from the snow, carried none of his earlier confidence, replaced instead by the bitter acceptance of someone who had gambled everything and lost. The throne remains where it belongs, Kael announced, shifting back to his human form as the assembled pack watched with renewed respect and relief evident across countless faces. Draven's ambition ends here, today, before the entire pack is witness. Draven, recognizing the finality of his defeat, offered no further challenge, simply bowing his head in acknowledgement before retreating from the clearing, his earlier supporters already beginning to distance themselves from his fallen cause. Owen moved quickly to Kael's side, offering support as exhaustion from the fight finally caught up with him, while Elena rushed forward as well, unable to hold back any longer. "You did it," she breathed, relief flooding through her as she reached him, her hands finding his despite the blood and exhaustion evident across his form. "We did it," Kael corrected gently, his amber eyes finding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch despite everything they had just witnessed. "Your words shifted this fight as much as anything I managed on my own. I owe you more than I can properly express." The pack, witnessing this exchange, began to understand something profound about the human woman standing beside their alpha king, her courage and conviction evident to everyone who had heard her speak during the fight's critical moment. Whispers of respect began replacing the earlier suspicion that had greeted her arrival, the pack recognizing in her something worthy of genuine consideration rather than simple dismissal. In the days that followed, as Kael's authority was fully restored and the pack settled back into stable order under his renewed leadership, he called together the entire community for a formal gathering, one that carried significance beyond simple celebration of victory over Draven's failed rebellion. 5 days ago, Kael announced before the assembled pack, Elena standing beside him with her heart full of emotions she was only beginning to properly understand. "I was a wounded wolf, trapped and dying in a storm, saved by a woman who owed me nothing and expected nothing in return. She showed me kindness without knowing who I was, courage without understanding the danger she faced, and loyalty that proved as valuable in this conflict as any warrior's strength." He turned to Elena then, his expression carrying open affection that needed no further words to explain. "I would ask this pack to recognize Elena Marsh not simply as a guest within our territory, but as my chosen mate, my equal partner in leading the Northlands forward." The pack's response came swiftly, howls rising in unified celebration that echoed across the mountains, a sound Elena had once found terrifying, but now understood as a declaration of acceptance and welcome. She looked at Kael, the wolf she had once called Shadow, now recognized fully as both the man and the king he truly was, and felt the isolation that had defined her entire life, finally, completely dissolve. "I once thought I would spend my whole life as an outsider," she said quietly, meant only for him, amid the celebratory roar surrounding them. "I never imagined that saving a freezing wolf during a storm would lead me here, standing beside a king, finally belonging somewhere completely." Cale took her hand, his amber eyes warm with a promise that needed no further declaration. "You were never simply saving a stranger that night," he said softly. "You were finding your way home, just as I was finding mine in you." Together, they turned to face their pack, the Northlands stretching before them under a clear winter sky. The storm that had once nearly claimed Cale's life, now feeling like nothing more than the necessary darkness that had led them both toward an unexpected, extraordinary dawn.